The phone call came at 9:47 a.m. on my 80th birthday. Not from my son Caleb, but from First National Bank. "Mrs. Washington, we need to discuss the overdue renewal on the Clearwater Electronics loan you co-signed," the voice said coldly. "The grace period expired yesterday." I sat in my kitchen in Brookhaven, staring at the birthday cake I'd bought for myself, and felt something shift inside me. 43 years I'd poured into building that electronics store with my late husband. 22 years since I'd co-signed that business loan to help Caleb expand into 3 locations. And on the most important birthday of my life, a milestone I'd been dreaming of celebrating with my only child, he couldn't even remember to call. But as I listened to the banker's urgent tone, a calm clarity washed over me. If my son could, forget the woman who sacrificed everything for his success. Perhaps it was time I forgot something too. Something that would remind him exactly what forgetting really costs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence in my Brookhaven kitchen was deafening. Not a single text message, not one phone call, not even a rushed voicemail apologizing for being late with birthday wishes. Just the steady tick of the grandfather clock my late husband Edmund had given me for our 25th anniversary, marking each passing second of what should have been the most celebrated day of my life. 80 years old. 8 decades of memories, struggles, triumphs, and losses. A milestone birthday that comes once in a lifetime, if you're blessed enough to reach it at all. And my son Caleb, the boy I'd raised alone after Edmund's heart attack, the young man I'd sacrificed my own dreams to support through college and business school, the successful entrepreneur who now owned 3 thriving electronics stores across the county, had completely forgotten. I stared at the small vanilla cake from Morrison's Bakery sitting untouched on my kitchen table, its single candle unlit. The same bakery where I'd bought Caleb's birthday cakes for 25 years, always making sure his celebrations were perfect, always putting his happiness above everything else. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd driven there myself yesterday, purchasing my own birthday cake because no one else had thought to do it. The morning sun streamed through the lace curtains I'd hung in this house 37 years ago, casting familiar patterns across the worn linoleum floor. This kitchen had witnessed so many birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings. The scratch marks on the doorframe still showed Caleb's height measurements from childhood, each line marked with a date and his age in my careful handwriting. The refrigerator still displayed a faded photo of him at his business school graduation, beaming with pride as he held his MBA diploma, his arm around my shoulders. I'd been so proud that day. My son, the first in our family to earn a graduate degree, ready to take on the world with the electronics expertise he'd learned from watching his father and the business acumen he'd gained through years of education, I'd worked 3 jobs to afford. When Edmund died during Caleb's sophomore year, I'd mortgaged this house twice to keep him in school. When he graduated and wanted to expand the single electronics store Edmund had left us into a full chain, I'd co-signed every loan, put my own retirement savings on the line, and believed with every fiber of my being that his success would be worth the sacrifice. And for years, it seemed like it was. Clearwater Electronics had grown from our modest storefront in downtown Brookhaven to 3 locations across Millfield County. Caleb had married his college sweetheart, Allison, a lovely girl from a well-established family who worked as a marketing executive at a prestigious firm in Westbridge. They'd bought a beautiful home in the exclusive Oakmont Hills subdivision, complete with a swimming pool and 3-car garage. Their Christmas cards always featured professional photos of them in designer clothes, posed perfectly in front of their granite kitchen island or marble fireplace. But somewhere along the way, the weekly phone calls had become monthly. The monthly visits had become holidays only. And now, even the holidays were strained affairs where Caleb seemed more interested in checking his phone than engaging in conversation. Last Christmas, he'd spent most of dinner discussing a potential fourth store location with someone on his Bluetooth earpiece, while Allison made polite conversation about my health and the weather. I'd told myself it was natural. Successful people are busy people. He was building an empire, securing his future, living the American dream we'd always wanted for him. The fact that his success had created distance between us was simply the price of achievement. I'd convinced myself that I was being selfish, to want more of his time and attention. But this morning, sitting alone in my kitchen on my 80th birthday, that rationalization crumbled like old wallpaper. This wasn't about wanting more attention. This was about basic human decency, about remembering the people who'd made your success possible, about honoring the woman who'd given up her own dreams so you could chase yours. I'd worked as a seamstress at Hartley's dress shop for 43 years, saving every penny to support Caleb's education and business ventures. I'd driven a 15-year-old Honda Civic until it literally wouldn't start anymore, then bought another used car so I could continue co-signing loans for his business expansions. I'd turned down countless invitations from my church group and the Brookhaven Senior Center because I was always worried about having enough money to help if Caleb needed it. And for what? So I could spend my 80th birthday alone, eating grocery store cake while my son was probably at some business meeting or golf outing, completely oblivious to the significance of this day. The grandfather clock chimed 10 a.m., and I felt something harden inside my chest. Not anger, exactly, but a cold, crystalline clarity that cut through decades of enabling and excuse-making. I'd spent my entire adult life putting Caleb first, making his needs my priority, measuring my worth by his success. But what had that devotion earned me? A forgotten birthday and a son who treated my love like a forgettable convenience. As I sat there in the growing silence, surrounded by the memories of a lifetime spent in service to others, I realized that perhaps it was time to stop remembering everything for everyone else. Perhaps it was time to start forgetting a few things myself. The phone would ring eventually. Caleb would remember, probably sometime this evening, and call with a rushed apology and promises to make it up to me. He'd send flowers, or have Allison pick out an expensive gift that showed no personal thought. He'd schedule a dinner at some upscale restaurant where we could sit across from each other making stilted conversation while he checked his phone between courses. But this time, his forgotten birthday would have consequences he never saw coming. This time, there would be a price for taking my love and sacrifice for granted. This time, I was going to forget something too. Before we dive deeper into this story, I want you to pause for a moment and think about the people in your own life. Think about that parent, grandparent, or mentor who sacrificed everything for your success. The one who co-signed loans when banks wouldn't trust you alone. The one who worked extra shifts to pay for your education. The one who believed in your dreams even when you stopped believing in them yourself. Now imagine forgetting their most important milestone, not just any birthday, but their 80th. A birthday that represents 8 decades of life, love, struggle, and perseverance. A birthday that might very well be among their last. If this scenario makes your stomach drop, if it makes you want to immediately call someone you haven't spoken to in too long, then you understand exactly how I felt that morning, in my Brookhaven kitchen. And if you're watching this from anywhere in the world, whether you're in Tokyo checking your phone before work, in London having your afternoon tea, or right here in small-town America like me, I want you to know that this story is about more than just a forgotten birthday. This is about what happens when love becomes a one-way street, when sacrifice becomes expectation, when the people who built the foundation of your success become invisible in the shadow of your achievements. And most importantly, this is about what happens when a woman who's spent her entire life remembering everything for everyone else finally decides to forget. Before this day was over, my relationship with my son Caleb would be forever changed. The business empire we'd built together would hang in the balance, and I would discover just how much power lies in the simple act of forgetting at exactly the right moment. But to understand how we got to this point, how a devoted mother could reach a place where she'd risk everything her son had worked for, you need to know our story. You need to understand the 43 years of sacrifice that led to this moment of reckoning. You need to see how small compromises and little dismissals can accumulate over decades until they create a chasm that seems impossible to bridge. So let me tell you about Madeline Washington. That was my name before I became simply Caleb's mother to most people in Brookhaven. Let me tell you about the woman I was before motherhood consumed my identity, before sacrifice became my defining characteristic, before love became something I gave freely but rarely received in return. Because this story isn't just about a forgotten birthday. It's about the slow erosion of a relationship built on unequal foundations. It's about the moment when enabling stops and accountability begins. It's about what happens when a mother finally asks herself a question she's been avoiding for years. What do I get out of this relationship besides the privilege of giving everything away? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The answer to that question would shake our family to its core. It would force my son to confront truths about gratitude, responsibility, and the real cost of success. And it would teach both of us that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop protecting them from the consequences of their choices. You see, when people talk about unconditional love, they often forget that healthy relationships require conditions. They require mutual respect, basic consideration, and the acknowledgement that love is a two-way street. For too many years, I'd convinced myself that asking for nothing in return was the purest form of love. I'd believed that a mother's role was to give endlessly without expectation, to support without question, to remember everything while asking to be remembered for nothing. But that morning, staring at my lonely birthday cake, I realized that unconditional giving had created unconditional taking. My refusal to set boundaries had taught my son that my love, my time, my sacrifice, and my financial support were unlimited resources he could access without reciprocation or even basic courtesy. And if you're thinking this sounds familiar, if you recognize yourself in this story either as the giver or the taker, then you understand why this moment was so significant. This wasn't just about a birthday. This was about decades of accumulated hurt, years of one-sided sacrifice, and a lifetime of being taken for granted finally reaching its breaking point. What happened next would change everything. The phone call I received that morning would give me an opportunity I'd never had before, the chance to teach my son what forgetting really feels like. The chance to show him that the woman who'd spent 43 years remembering his every need, supporting his every dream, and enabling his every success could also choose to forget. And the thing I chose to forget would threaten everything he'd built. Every store location, every business loan, every expansion plan, every dream of empire, all of it hanging by the thread of one elderly woman's memory and her willingness to continue protecting a son who'd forgotten she existed. By the end of this day, Caleb would learn that there are some things in life you simply cannot afford to forget. He would discover that taking someone's love for granted doesn't just hurt feelings. It can have consequences that reach far beyond emotion into the very practical realities of business, finance, and survival. And I would learn something too. I would learn that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say to someone isn't "I love you," or "I forgive you," or even "I'm proud of you." Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is "I forgot." Because when everything you've built depends on someone else's memory, their decision to forget can change your life in ways you never imagined possible. This is that story, the story of how one forgotten birthday became one forgotten loan renewal, and how that single act of reciprocal forgetting would either destroy our relationship forever or finally teach us both what it means to truly value each other. My name is Madeline Washington, though for the past 28 years, Most people in Brookhaven have known me simply as Caleb's mother, or that nice lady from the electronics store. But I wasn't always defined by my relationship to someone else. There was a time when I had my own identity, my own dreams, my own sense of purpose that existed independent of anyone else's needs or achievements. Before motherhood reshaped my entire existence, I was Madeline Chen. Yes, I took my first husband's name and kept it even after Edmund passed, partly out of love and partly because starting over with a new identity at 62 felt like more change than I could handle. But long before I became Mrs. Washington, I was a young woman with aspirations that stretched far beyond the borders of our small town. I grew up in Millfield, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who ran a small tailoring shop called Chen's Alterations. My parents, David and Lynn Chen, had arrived in America in 1943 with nothing but sewing skills, determination, and an unshakable belief that hard work could transform any dream into reality. They spoke broken English but understood the universal language of craftsmanship, spending 12-hour days hunched over sewing machines, turning ill-fitting clothes into perfectly tailored garments for the growing middle class of post-war America. From the time I could hold a needle steady, I was working alongside them, learning not just the technical skills of tailoring, but the deeper art of transformation. How to see potential in flawed materials. How to take something imperfect and make it beautiful. How to honor both form and function in everything you create. My parents taught me that good work was its own reward, but they also instilled in me a hunger for something more than the small world of alterations and repairs. I was the first person in my family to graduate high school, and I had dreams of attending design school in Chicago or New York. I sketched fashion designs constantly, filling notebook after notebook with elaborate evening gowns, innovative daywear, and avant-garde pieces that pushed the boundaries of what clothing could be. My portfolio was impressive enough to earn me a scholarship to the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. An opportunity that felt like winning the lottery to a girl from small-town Illinois. But life has a way of reshaping dreams when you're not paying attention. During my senior year of high school, I met Edmund Washington at a church social. He was 22, 4 years older than me, and already running his father's electronics repair shop after old Mr. Washington suffered a stroke. Edmund was kind, stable, and completely enchanted by my ambition and creativity. He supported my design dreams enthusiastically, promising that once we were married and he'd expanded the electronics business, we'd have enough money for me to attend design school and eventually open my own boutique. Looking back now, I can see how easily I traded my own timeline for someone else's. How naturally I shifted from when I go to design school to when we have enough money for design school to when the electronics business is more established to eventually just someday. The scholarship to fit had an expiration date, and I let it pass while I helped Edmund modernize his father's repair shop and transform it into a retail electronics store that could compete with the larger chains moving into the area. We married in 1965 when I was 19 and he was 23. The wedding was small but beautiful. I designed and sewed my own dress, a simple but elegant A-line gown with hand-beaded details that took me 3 months to complete. It was the last original design I would finish for decades, though I didn't know it at the time. Our early marriage was happy in the way that partnerships built on mutual respect and shared goals tend to be. We worked side by side building Clearwater Electronics from a small repair shop into a thriving retail business. I handled the books, managed inventory, and dealt with customers while Edmund focused on repairs and staying current with rapidly changing technology. We were a team, building something together, and even though design school had faded into a someday dream, I felt fulfilled by our shared purpose. For 15 years, we tried to have children. 15 years of hope and disappointment, of medical appointments and fertility treatments we could barely afford, of watching friends and neighbors celebrate pregnancies and first steps while we wondered if parenthood would ever happen for us. I threw myself into the business during those years, expanding our inventory to include the latest home computers and video game systems. learning about emerging technologies so I could better serve our customers. By the time I turned 34, I'd made peace with the possibility that we might never have children. Edmund and I had begun discussing adoption seriously, and we'd started planning renovations to the house that would include a proper nursery. I'd even begun sketching children's clothing designs in my spare time, thinking that perhaps I could start a small side business creating custom outfits for the kids in our community. Then, like a miracle wrapped in morning sickness and exhaustion, I became pregnant with Caleb at 35. After so many years of disappointment, pregnancy felt like a gift beyond measure. Every symptom was welcomed, every doctor's appointment was a celebration, every kick and flutter was confirmation that our family was finally becoming complete. Caleb was born on a snowy February morning in 1967, healthy and perfect, and absolutely worth every year of waiting. I remember holding him for the first time and feeling my entire identity shift in an instant. All those dreams of fashion design, all those sketches and aspirations and carefully laid plans, they didn't disappear, exactly. But they suddenly seemed less important than this tiny person who needed me completely. Edmund was a devoted father from day one, the kind of man who woke up for 2 a.m. feedings without complaint and spent hours on the floor teaching Caleb how to stack blocks and sort shapes. Our little family felt complete in a way I'd never experienced before. The electronics store provided a comfortable living, our marriage was strong, and our son was healthy and bright and everything we'd hoped for. But life, as I've learned over 8 decades, rarely allows happiness to exist without testing. When Caleb was 15, Edmund suffered a massive heart attack while installing a new security system at the store. He died instantly, at 52 years old, leaving me to raise our son alone and run Clearwater Electronics without the partner who'd been my anchor for 22 years. That loss changed everything. Not just the practical realities of single, parenthood and business ownership, but my entire sense of what mattered in life. Suddenly, my dreams seemed selfish and unimportant compared to making sure Caleb had every opportunity to succeed. Fashion design felt frivolous when there were college funds to build and business loans to manage, and a teenage boy who needed stability more than his mother needed creative fulfillment. So I made choices, practical choices that seemed obvious at the time, but would echo through decades in ways I never anticipated. I chose Caleb's future over my own dreams. I chose his needs over my wants. I chose his success over my identity. And for 28 years, those choices felt like love. They felt like the natural, selfless things a good mother does for her child. It never occurred to me that love without boundaries becomes enablement, or that sacrifice without reciprocity becomes resentment. Until the morning of my 80th birthday, when those decades of choices finally came home to roost in the form of silence, forgetting, and the stark realization that the boy I'd sacrificed everything for had grown into a man who could forget I existed. The call from Edmund's cardiologist came on a Tuesday afternoon in March 1982, just 3 days after Caleb's 15th birthday party. I remember the date so clearly because we'd spent the weekend celebrating, not just Caleb's birthday, but the fact that Clearwater Electronics had finally turned its first real profit since we'd expanded into personal computers. Edmund had been working 18-hour days for months, staying late to learn the intricacies of the new Apple computers and IBM systems that were revolutionizing the industry. Mrs. Washington, Dr. Harrison's voice was gentle but urgent over the phone. I need you to bring your husband in immediately. His stress test results from last week show some irregularities that concern me greatly. I was standing in the back office of our store, surrounded by inventory sheets and employee schedules, when that call shattered our carefully constructed world. Edmund was in the showroom, patiently explaining the benefits of our new Commodore 64 display to a young father who wanted to buy his son's first computer. Through the glass partition, I could see him gesturing enthusiastically, his face animated with the passion he always showed when discussing technology. He looked so vital, so healthy, so completely alive that Dr. Harrison's words seemed impossible. Edmund was only 52, the same age as my father when he'd immigrated to America and started building a new life from nothing. 52 was supposed to be the prime of life, not the beginning of medical emergencies and frightening phone calls from cardiologists. But Edmund's stress test revealed what we'd all been too busy to notice: years of 14-hour workdays, business pressure, and the constant stress of competing with big-box stores had taken a devastating toll on his heart. Dr. Harrison spoke in terms I barely understood: blocked arteries, decreased ejection fraction, the need for immediate intervention. What I understood perfectly was the fear in his voice and the urgency of his recommendations. "He needs surgery, Mrs. Washington. Soon, and after that, significant lifestyle changes. No more 12-hour days, no more high-stress situations, and absolutely no more of the physical demands of running a retail electronics business." I hung up the phone and walked into the showroom on unsteady legs, watching my husband complete the computer sale with his characteristic enthusiasm and expertise. How do you tell the man you love that the work he's passionate about, the business you've built together, the life you've constructed around shared goals and mutual support, how do you tell him that all of it is literally killing him? That night, after we'd closed the store and Caleb had gone upstairs to work on homework, Edmund and I sat at our kitchen table while I repeated Dr. Harrison's words as gently as I could. The color drained from Edmund's face as I explained the test results, the need for surgery, and the doctor's insistence that continuing to run Clearwater Electronics at its current pace would likely trigger a fatal heart attack within months. "But the spring inventory is coming in," Edmund said quietly, as if scheduling could somehow override medical reality. "And we just signed the lease expansion to add that computer training center in the back room. Maddie, we're so close to really making this business something special." I reached across the table and took his hands, feeling the calluses from years of electronics work and the slight tremor that I now realized might have been an early warning sign. "The business doesn't matter if you're not here to run it, Edmund. Nothing matters if you're not here." What followed were 3 of the most difficult months of our marriage. Edmund underwent triple bypass surgery at Westbridge General Hospital, a procedure that saved his life but left him weak, frustrated, and completely unable to participate in the day-to-day operations of Clearwater Electronics. I found myself running the store alone for the first time, managing inventory, handling customer service, dealing with suppliers, and trying to learn enough about the rapidly evolving computer market to keep us competitive. Caleb, bless his heart, stepped up in ways that amazed me. Every day after school, he'd come straight to the store and work until closing time, learning to operate the cash register, helping customers with basic questions, and even assisting with simple computer setup procedures. At 15, he showed a natural aptitude for technology that rivaled his father's, combined with a customer service instinct that seemed to come from pure intuition. "Mom," he said one evening as we were closing up, "maybe Dad getting sick is actually an opportunity. I mean, I know that sounds terrible, but what if we use this time to really modernize the business? I've been reading about these new personal computer networks, and I think we could offer services that none of the big stores provide." His enthusiasm was infectious, and his ideas were genuinely innovative. Over the next several months, as Edmund slowly recovered, Caleb and I transformed Clearwater Electronics from a traditional repair shop into a cutting-edge computer retailer and service center. We were among the first stores in Millfield County to offer computer networking services for small businesses, and Caleb designed a customer education program that helped local businesses understand how computers could improve their operations. By the time Edmund was cleared to return to light work 6 months later, the business had evolved beyond anything we'd originally imagined. Our revenue had doubled, we'd hired 3 new employees, and we were fielding calls from businesses as far away as Springfield who'd heard about our innovative approach to computer services. But Edmund's return to work came with strict limitations. Dr. Harrison had been clear: No more than 6 hours per day. No lifting anything heavier than 10 pounds. No high-stress situations, and absolutely no working weekends or evenings. For a man who'd built his identity around being the hardest worker in the room, these restrictions felt like a prison sentence. "I feel useless, Maddie," he confessed one night after a particularly frustrating day when he'd had to leave early, while Caleb and I handled a complex business computer installation. "You and Caleb are running circles around me, and I'm supposed to be the expert." That's when we made the decision that would reshape our family dynamics for decades to come. Edmund would focus on the technical aspects he loved most: computer, repair, staying current with new technologies, and training our employees, while Caleb and I would handle sales, customer service, and business development. It seemed like a perfect solution that honored Edmund's limitations while utilizing everyone's strengths. What I didn't anticipate was how naturally Caleb would excel in the business world, or how quickly he'd surpass both Edmund and me in understanding not just technology, but market trends, customer psychology, and growth strategies. By his senior year of high school, Caleb was essentially functioning as our business manager, making decisions about inventory, pricing, and store policies with a confidence that sometimes took my breath away. "I want to study business in college," he announced during dinner one night. "But I also want to keep working at the store. I think Clearwater Electronics could be something really big, Mom. Like, regional chain big. Maybe even bigger than that." His ambition thrilled and terrified me in equal measure. I was proud of his vision and his capabilities, but I also worried about the pressure he was putting on himself at such a young age. More than that, I worried about what would happen to our family dynamics if the business continued to grow beyond what Edmund's health could handle. But those concerns seemed manageable compared to the joy of watching my son discover his passion and excel at something that could provide security for our family. Edmund's heart attack had shown us how fragile our financial stability really was, and Caleb's business acumen felt like insurance against future uncertainty. I never imagined that encouraging his ambition would eventually lead to my being forgotten on my 80th birthday. I never anticipated that supporting his dreams would gradually transform me from an equal partner into a silent enabler. I never realized that teaching him to prioritize business success would eventually mean teaching him to take my love and sacrifice for granted. But that morning, staring at my lonely birthday cake, I finally understood the unintended consequences of that long-ago decision to make Caleb's success our family's primary focus. The heart attack that nearly killed Edmund had indeed changed everything, just not in the ways we'd expected. It had created a dynamic where my son's achievements became more important than my identity, where his needs superseded everyone else's, and where his success became the measure by which our entire family evaluated its worth. And now, 28 years later, it was time to see what happened when that dynamic was finally challenged. The years that followed Edmund's heart attack became a testament to what a mother's love and determination could accomplish when channeled toward a single purpose. Looking back now, I can see how completely I threw myself into building not just a business, but a legacy for my son. Every decision, every sacrifice, every long day and sleepless night was motivated by one driving belief. Caleb's success would justify any price I had to pay. Those weren't just years of growth for Clearwater Electronics. They were years of transformation for our entire family. While Edmund focused on his health and the technical aspects of the business he could still manage, I became something I'd never planned to be: a businesswoman, a strategist, and most importantly, Caleb's silent partner in building an empire. I remember the first time we discussed expanding beyond our original Brookhaven location. Caleb was a junior at Millfield County Community College, studying business administration while working at the store 30 hours a week. He'd been analyzing our sales data and customer demographics with the intensity of a Wall Street analyst, staying up until midnight creating spreadsheets and market projections on our store's computer. "Mom," he said one evening as we closed up, his arms full of printouts and charts, I think we're missing a huge opportunity. Look at these numbers from the Westbridge area. There's no dedicated electronics store within 20 miles, but the median income is 30% higher than Brookhaven. If we opened a second location there, we could probably double our revenue within 2 years. His enthusiasm was infectious, but the financial reality was daunting. Opening a second store would require a substantial loan, expanded inventory, additional staff, and the kind of business risk that kept me awake at night. Edmund's medical bills had already stretched our resources thin, and the thought of taking on debt that could potentially destroy everything we'd built felt terrifying. But when I looked at my 19-year-old son's face, glowing with ambition and confidence, I saw something that made the risk feel worthwhile. I saw a young man who'd found his calling, who understood business in ways that came naturally to him, who had the vision and drive to build something extraordinary. How could I let financial fear limit his potential? What kind of loan would we need? I asked, and I'll never forget the smile that spread across Caleb's face when he realized I was seriously considering his proposal. The loan application process became my education in just how much faith the banking system requires from small business owners. First National Bank of Millfield was willing to lend us the money for the Westbridge expansion, but they wanted collateral that went far beyond the business assets. They wanted our house, our personal savings, and what they called personal guarantees from both Edmund and me. Mrs. Washington, the loan officer explained during our third meeting, this is standard procedure for family businesses. The bank needs to know that the primary stakeholders have real skin in the game. Your willingness to put your personal assets at risk demonstrates your confidence in the business plan. I signed those papers without hesitation, my signature committing our home, our retirement savings, and our financial future to my son's dreams. Edmund was more cautious, worried about the health implications of additional stress, but he ultimately supported the decision because he could see how much it meant to Caleb. The Westbridge store opened in the fall of 1985, just as Caleb started his senior year of college. I'll never forget opening day, watching customers stream through the doors of our beautiful new location, seeing Caleb in his suit and tie explaining computer systems to potential buyers with the confidence of someone twice his age, feeling the pride that comes from watching your child excel at something they're passionate about. But success brought its own challenges. Managing 2 locations meant I was working 12-hour days, 6 days a week, driving back and forth between Brookhaven and Westbridge to handle problems, train new employees, and make sure both stores maintained the customer service standards that had built our reputation. Edmund tried to help, but his cardiologist had been clear about his limitations, and I found myself protecting him from stress by handling more and more of the business challenges myself. Caleb threw himself into learning every aspect of operations with an intensity that sometimes worried me. He'd spend mornings at the Brookhaven store, afternoons at Westbridge, and evenings analyzing sales data and developing marketing strategies. His grades at school remained excellent, but I rarely saw him engage in the typical college activities that his peers enjoyed. While other students were going to parties or joining clubs, Caleb was designing inventory systems and negotiating with suppliers. "Don't you want to have some fun?" I asked him one Saturday evening when I found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by vendor catalogs and pricing sheets. "This is fun for me, Mom," he replied without looking up from his work. "I love figuring out how to make the business better. And besides, every hour I spend on this now is an hour that pays off in the future. I want to graduate college and be ready to really expand, maybe a third store, maybe even franchising opportunities." His dedication impressed me, but it also concerned me. At 21, he seemed to have the drive and focus of someone much older, but I wondered what he was missing by concentrating so intensely on business success. When had my fun-loving little boy become this serious young man who measured every decision by its potential return on investment? The answer, I realized, was gradual. It had happened during the years when I'd praised his business insights more than his report cards. when I'd celebrated sales milestones more enthusiastically than his birthday parties, when I'd unconsciously taught him that his worth was tied to his ability to contribute to our family's financial success. But those concerns seemed small compared to the pride I felt watching him graduate summa cum laude with his business degree, knowing that he'd managed to excel academically while helping build something that would provide security for our entire family. The day he walked across that stage, diploma in hand, I felt like every sacrifice had been worthwhile. "I want to focus on expanding the business full-time now," Caleb announced at his graduation dinner. "I think we could have 5 locations within 3 years, maybe 10 within 5. But we'll need more capital, more loans, more systematic growth. Planning. More loans meant more personal guarantees, more collateral, more risk. But it also meant more opportunities for my son to build something extraordinary. When First National Bank required additional co-signers for our expansion loans, I didn't hesitate to put my name on every document. When they wanted updated appraisals on our house to secure larger credit lines, I scheduled the appointments myself. By the time Caleb was 25, Clearwater Electronics had 3 locations and was generating more revenue than I'd ever imagined possible. He'd married Allison Fox, a lovely marketing executive from a well-established Westbridge family, and they'd purchased a beautiful home in Oakmont Hills that showcased their success and social status. But somewhere in those years of growth and achievement, something subtle had shifted in our relationship. Caleb's gratitude for my support had gradually transformed into expectation. My willingness to co-sign loans and provide financial backing had become an assumed resource rather than a generous gift. My pride in his accomplishments had become my primary identity, while his appreciation for my sacrifice had faded into background noise. I told myself these changes were natural. Successful people become confident, and confident people sometimes seem less grateful because they're focused on future goals rather than past support. I convinced myself that Caleb's increasing independence was a sign of healthy maturity, not growing indifference to the foundation I'd provided for his success. Looking back now, I can see how completely I'd programmed myself to find joy in his achievements while asking for nothing in return. I'd trained him to think of my love, my support, and my financial backing as unlimited resources that required no reciprocal investment of time, attention, or even basic courtesy. For 28 years, that dynamic had felt like love. It had felt like the natural order of a mother-son relationship built on mutual respect and shared goals. But sitting alone on my 80th birthday, I finally understood that what I'd called love had actually been enablement, and what I'd called support had actually been the systematic erosion of any expectation that my own needs mattered. The business we'd built together had made Caleb wealthy and successful. But it had also taught him that taking my sacrifice for granted was not just acceptable. It was his birthright, and that was a lesson I was finally ready to help him unlearn. The changes in Caleb didn't happen overnight. They accumulated so gradually, so naturally, that I found myself making excuses for behaviors that would have alarmed me if I'd witnessed them in someone else's family. It's remarkable how easily we can rationalize the erosion of respect when it happens incrementally, disguised as the natural evolution of a successful person's priorities. The first warning sign came during Caleb's engagement to Allison Fox in 1992. I'd known the Fox family peripherally for years. Richard Fox owned the largest insurance agency in Westbridge, and his wife Patricia served on the boards of several prestigious charitable organizations. They were exactly the kind of established, socially connected family that I'd always hoped Caleb might marry into, the kind of people who could open doors and provide opportunities that our small-town electronics business never could. When Caleb brought Allison to Sunday dinner to announce their engagement, I was genuinely thrilled. She was intelligent, accomplished, and clearly devoted to my son. But during that meal, I noticed something that would become a pattern over the following decades. The way Caleb's demeanor shifted when he was around people he considered socially superior. Mother. he said. And the formal address jarred me because he'd called me Mom his entire life. Allison's family has suggested that we have the engagement party at the Westbridge Country Club. They're members there, and they think it would be a good opportunity for networking with some of the area's business leaders. I smiled and nodded, pleased that he was making connections that could benefit the business. But something about his tone bothered me, a subtle distance that hadn't been there before. When Allison excused herself to use the restroom, I asked Caleb if everything was all right. "Of course, Mom. It's just—" He glanced toward the hallway where Allison had gone, then lowered his voice. "The Foxes move in different circles than we do. Important circles. Richard plays golf with bank presidents and city council members. Patricia knows everyone who matters in Westbridge society. This engagement could really help us take Clearwater Electronics to the next level." There it was. The first time I heard my son speak about his personal relationships in terms of business advantage. The first time I realized he was beginning to view people, including his own family, through the lens of what they could contribute to his success. The engagement party at the Westbridge Country Club was an elegant affair that cost more than many people's annual salaries. The Foxes insisted on paying for everything, claiming it was their pleasure to welcome Caleb into their family. I wore my best dress, a navy blue suit I'd purchased for Edmund's funeral years earlier, and tried to blend in among the perfectly coiffed wives of insurance executives and bank vice presidents. During the party, I overheard a conversation that would haunt me for years afterward. I was standing near the bar, waiting to order a glass of wine, when I heard Allison speaking to a group of her friends about wedding plans. "The ceremony will be at First Presbyterian, of course," she was saying, "but we're still deciding about the reception. Caleb's mother would prefer something simple, but honestly, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make the right impression on people who could help his business." One of her friends asked, "What does she do?" His mother, I mean. There was a pause that lasted a heartbeat too long before Allison answered. "Oh, she works at the electronics store. She's very practical. Sweet woman, but not really familiar with how these things are typically done." The dismissal in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. I wasn't being criticized exactly, just gently categorized as someone whose opinions on important matters could be safely disregarded. When I looked around for Caleb, hoping to catch his eye and share a moment of connection in this sea of strangers, I found him deep in conversation with Richard Fox and two other men, his entire focus devoted to what appeared to be a serious business discussion. The wedding itself was beautiful but felt strangely impersonal. Everything was arranged according to Fox family traditions and social expectations, from the 3-course reception dinner to the string quartet that played during Dios. The ceremony. I was consulted about guest list additions and dietary restrictions, but when I tentatively suggested including some family traditions of our own, perhaps serving Edmund's favorite dessert or playing the song that had been meaningful during my own wedding, Allison gently explained that they'd already finalized all the details with their wedding planner. "We want everything to be perfect," she said with a smile that was kind but firm. "I'm sure you understand." I did understand. I understood that my son was marrying into a world where my input was politely irrelevant, where the things that mattered to our family were considered quaint but unsuitable for important occasions. And I told myself this was progress, evidence that Caleb was moving up in the world, building connections and social capital that would benefit everyone. But understanding didn't make it hurt less when I realized that my role in his life was shifting from advisor and partner to supportive background figure. During the wedding reception, I spent most of the evening at a table with Edmund's elderly sisters and a few longtime customers from the store, while Caleb and Allison circulated among tables full of business contacts and social influencers. After the honeymoon, the changes in Caleb became more pronounced. Our weekly Sunday dinners became monthly gatherings, then holiday-only affairs. When he did visit, The conversations focused almost exclusively on business matters or social obligations, related to Allison's family connections. The easy, affectionate relationship we'd always shared began to feel formal and transactional. "Mom, I need to ask you about co-signing another loan," he said during one visit in 1994. "We have an opportunity to open a 4th location in Springfield, but the bank wants additional collateral. Would you be willing to put the house up again?" The request itself wasn't unreasonable. I'd co-signed loans before, and the Springfield expansion made good business sense. But something about the way he asked bothered me. There was an assumption in his tone, a casual certainty that I would agree without question because I always had before. "Of course," I said, because that's what I always said. "Whatever you need, for the business." But later that evening, after he'd left to attend a dinner party at the country club, I found myself wondering when my son had stopped asking for my help and started expecting it. When had my willingness to support his dreams become an entitlement rather than a gift? The pattern continued throughout the 1990s. Caleb's success grew exponentially. By 1998, Clearwater Electronics had 6 locations and was generating millions in annual revenue. He and Allison had purchased an even larger home in the most exclusive section of Oakmont Hills, complete with a swimming pool, tennis court, and 3-car garage. Their Christmas cards featured professional photographs that looked like magazine spreads, all perfect smiles and designer clothes. But our relationship continued to deteriorate in small, almost imperceptible ways. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Visits became more rushed and business-focused. The spontaneous conversations about life, dreams, and family memories that had once defined our bond gradually disappeared, replaced by polite updates about store performance and social obligations. When I turned 70 in 2002, Caleb organized a lovely birthday dinner at an upscale restaurant in Westbridge. The meal was expensive and elegant, but something about the evening felt hollow. We sat across from each other, making polite conversation about business trends and weather patterns, like acquaintances rather than family members who'd once shared everything. "The Springfield store is performing above projections," he told me over dessert. "We're thinking about opening a 7th location next year, maybe in Bloomington. The demographics there are perfect for our target market." I nodded and smiled, proud of his success, but increasingly aware that he saw me primarily as a financial resource and business partner, rather than as his mother. When had we stopped talking about anything except Clearwater Electronics? When had my identity become so completely tied to my usefulness to his empire? The answers to those questions would become painfully clear over the following years, as my son's success continued to grow while his capacity for basic courtesy and consideration gradually withered. Each forgotten birthday, each canceled visit, each casual assumption that my support was unlimited and unconditional, built toward the morning when I would finally realize that love without boundaries had created a relationship without respect. But that realization was still years away. In 2002, sitting across from my successful, accomplished son in that expensive restaurant, I convinced myself that his distance was temporary, that his focus on business was just a phase, that the loving boy I'd raised was still there beneath the polished exterior of the successful businessman. I had no idea how much further our relationship would deteriorate before I finally found the courage to demand the respect I'd spent decades teaching him he didn't need to give. The decade of the 2000s brought unprecedented success to Clearwater Electronics, but it also marked the period when my relationship with Caleb transformed from distant to nearly non-existent. What had begun as casual dismissal of my opinions gradually evolved into something far more painful: the complete erasure of my significance in his life, except as a convenient source of financial backing and business support. By 2005, Caleb had achieved everything we'd once dreamed of and more. Clearwater Electronics had grown to 8 locations across 3 counties, employed over 60 people, and generated annual revenues that placed it among the top independent electronics retailers in the state. Business magazines had featured articles about his innovative approach to customer service and his ability to compete successfully against national chains. The local Chamber of Commerce had named him Entrepreneur of the Year twice, and he'd been invited to speak at business conferences as far away as Chicago and St. Louis. But success had changed him in ways that became increasingly difficult to ignore or excuse. The grateful son who'd once thanked me effusively for every loan co-signature and every piece of business advice had been replaced by a man who treated my ongoing support as an automatic entitlement, no more worthy of acknowledgement than the sunrise or the changing seasons. The shift became undeniable during the planning for Clearwater Electronics' 20th anniversary celebration in 2006. Caleb and Allison organized an elaborate party at the Westbridge Country Club, complete with catered dinner, live music, and speeches from local dignitaries. They'd invited suppliers, employees, business partners, and what seemed like half of Westbridge's social elite. I learned about the party not from my son, but from Agnes Morrison, who owned the bakery where I still shopped every week. "I'm so excited to be providing the desserts for Caleb's big anniversary party," she said, while boxing up my usual Saturday morning donuts. 20 years in business. That's quite an achievement. You must be so proud." I smiled and nodded, but inside, I felt a familiar sting of exclusion. When I casually mentioned the party to Caleb during our next phone conversation, he seemed surprised that I'd heard about it. "Oh, that," he said dismissively. "It's really just a business thing, Mom. Networking, client relations, that sort of thing. Probably pretty boring for you. Besides, it's on a weeknight, and I know you don't like driving to Westbridge after dark." The excuse was reasonable, but the underlying message was clear. I wasn't considered important enough to include in celebrations of the business we'd built together. The company I'd mortgaged my house to support, the enterprise I'd co-signed, countless loans to expand, the success story that had consumed my life for 2 decades. Apparently, I was no longer significant enough to warrant an invitation to its anniversary celebration. But the pattern of exclusion extended far beyond business events. Family gatherings became increasingly rare and awkward affairs, where I felt more like an obligation than a welcomed guest. During the few times Caleb and Allison did visit, usually around major holidays, their interactions with me felt perfunctory and rushed. Christmas 2007 was particularly painful. They arrived at my house on Christmas Eve for what had traditionally been our family gift exchange and dinner, but they spent most of the visit checking their phones and discussing their plans for a New Year's vacation to Aspen with the Fox family. "We can only stay about an hour, Mom," Caleb announced as soon as they walked through the door. "We promised the Foxes we'd attend their Christmas Eve party at the country club. Richard is introducing us to some potential investors who might be interested in franchising opportunities." Everything in his life had become about business connections and social advancement. Even Christmas, our most treasured family tradition, had been reduced to a brief obligation squeezed between more important commitments. During that hour, as I served the elaborate dinner I'd spent 2 days preparing, Caleb barely looked up from his BlackBerry. When I tried to engage them in conversation about family memories or ask about their plans for the new year, their responses were polite but distracted. I felt like a waitress in my own home, serving people who were counting the minutes until they could leave. The gift exchange was even more disheartening. I'd spent weeks choosing thoughtful presents, a vintage electronics manual I'd found for Caleb's collection, and a beautiful silk scarf for Allison that perfectly matched her new winter coat. Their gifts to me were clearly last-minute purchases, an expensive but impersonal gift certificate to a department store I'd never shopped at, and a generic World's Best Mom coffee mug that still had the price tag attached. But what hurt most wasn't the lack of thought in their gifts. It was the casual indifference to the effort I'd put into making the evening special. They didn't comment on the dinner, didn't seem to notice the decorations I'd hung throughout the house, and showed no awareness that I'd been looking forward to this visit for weeks. As they rushed out the door to attend their more important social engagement, Caleb kissed my cheek distractedly and said, "Thanks for dinner, Mom. We'll call you soon." They didn't call for 6 weeks. The business continued to thrive, which meant my role as financial co-signer became even more crucial. In 2008, when the economic recession threatened small businesses across the country, Caleb approached me about guaranteeing a substantial line of credit that would help Clearwater Electronics weather the financial storm. "The banks are getting nervous about everything," he explained during one of his increasingly rare visits. "But with your signature on the loan documents, they'll extend the credit line we need to maintain inventory and payroll. It's really just a formality. Business is still strong, and we'll probably never need to access the full amount." I signed the papers without hesitation, as I always did. But I noticed that Caleb's explanation of the loan terms had become more cursory over the years, his assumption of my agreement more automatic. There was no discussion of my comfort level with the risk, no acknowledgement of what I was putting on the line, no expression of gratitude for my continued willingness to back his ventures with my personal assets. The recession actually strengthened Clearwater Electronics' position in the market. While larger competitors struggled with corporate debt and reduced consumer spending, our local focus and personalized service attracted customers who were cutting back on major purchases, but still needed electronics repair and support. By 2010, Caleb was talking about expansion opportunities created by competitors' closures. But our personal relationship continued to deteriorate. Phone calls became monthly obligations that lasted 15 minutes and covered only business updates, and perfunctory health inquiries. Visits became holiday-only affairs that felt more like diplomatic meetings than family gatherings. The easy affection and genuine connection that had once defined our bond seemed to have evaporated entirely. The most painful example came during my 75th birthday in 2012. I'd mentioned the milestone several times in our phone conversations, hoping Caleb might suggest celebrating together. As the date approached, I found myself checking my mailbox hopefully for a card, or making sure my phone was charged in case he called early in the day. The birthday came and went with no acknowledgement whatsoever. No card, no call, no visit, no flowers, nothing. It was as if the date that marked my 3/4 of a century on Earth was completely invisible to the son I'd devoted my life to supporting. When he finally called 3 days later for one of his routine business check-ins, he mentioned the birthday casually, almost as an afterthought. "Oh, and happy birthday, Mom. Sorry I missed it. We were in Miami looking at potential franchise locations. Time just got away from me." Time got away from him. As if my 75th birthday was a minor appointment that had slipped through the cracks of his busy schedule, rather than a milestone that deserved acknowledgement and celebration from the person who owed his success to my sacrifices. That was the moment I should have recognized what our relationship had become. That was when I should have demanded the respect and consideration that any human being deserves from their family. But instead, I made excuses. I told myself he was under a lot of pressure with the business expansion. I convinced myself that successful people sometimes lose track of personal details when they're focused on important professional goals. I enabled his disrespect by accepting it, and in doing so, I taught him that my feelings, my needs, and my basic human dignity were negotiable commodities in our relationship. But even I had limits, though it would take 8 more years and the devastating silence of my 80th birthday to finally reach them. April 15th, 2020, my 80th birthday. A date I'd been both anticipating and dreading for months, knowing it represented not just a personal milestone but a test of whether my relationship with Caleb retained any trace of the love and respect that had once defined it. 80 years old. The phrase carried weight that younger people couldn't fully comprehend. It meant I'd survived the Great Depression as a child, witnessed World War II as a teenager, lived through the Civil Rights Movement, the moon landing, the rise of computers, and the digital revolution. It meant I'd buried my parents, lost my husband, and spent nearly 3 decades building a business empire that had made my son wealthy beyond our wildest dreams. More pragmatically, it meant I was entering the demographic where birthdays became precious and finite. At 80, you don't assume there will be 20 more celebrations. You don't take for granted that everyone you love will be around for next year's milestone. 80 is the age when each birthday becomes a gift that deserves acknowledgement, especially from the people whose lives you've shaped and whose success you've enabled. I'd been dropping hints about the significance of this birthday for months, mentioning it during our increasingly brief phone conversations and hoping Caleb might suggest planning something special. Not a lavish party. I'd never been one for elaborate celebrations, but something meaningful that acknowledged the milestone and gave us an opportunity to spend time together. 80 is a big number, I'd said during our February phone call. Hard to believe I've been on this earth for 8 decades. Wow, that is something, Caleb had replied, but I could hear the distraction in his voice, the half attention he gave to conversations that didn't relate to business matters. Listen, Mom, I need to run. We're in negotiations for a new lease agreement in Bloomington, and the lawyers are waiting for my call. In March, I'd been more direct. My birthday's coming up next month, the big 80. Maybe we could plan a nice dinner somewhere? Just the 3 of us? Absolutely, we should definitely do something, he'd said with the vague enthusiasm of someone agreeing to a future commitment they had no intention of keeping. Let me check our calendar and get back to you. Things are crazy right now with the spring inventory push. He never got back to me. As April 15th approached, I found myself in the peculiar position of having to decide whether to plan my own birthday celebration. Should I call friends and organize something myself? Should I make dinner reservations and then invite Caleb, risking the humiliation of his declining? Should I simply pretend the day didn't matter and wait to see if he remembered on his own? I chose to wait. Despite 8 years of accumulated evidence that Caleb had lost the capacity for basic consideration, some stubborn part of me still believed that an 80th birthday would be different. This was too big, too significant, too obviously important to overlook. Even the most distracted, business-obsessed son would remember his mother's 80th birthday. I woke up on April 15th with a flutter of anticipation in my chest that I immediately tried to suppress. At my age, hoping for acknowledgement felt pathetic, but I couldn't help myself. This was my son, the boy I'd raised, the man whose success had been built on my sacrifices. Surely he would remember. I made myself a nice breakfast, fresh coffee, toast with the expensive jam I usually saved for special occasions, and a small glass of orange juice in my good crystal. I dressed carefully in my favorite blue dress and the pearl earrings Edmund had given me for our 20th anniversary. If Caleb decided to visit or suggest an impromptu celebration, I wanted to be ready. By mid-morning, I was checking my phone, every few minutes, hoping for a text message or missed call notification. Nothing. I told myself it was still early, that he was probably planning to call later in the day, maybe even planning a surprise visit. I spent the afternoon cleaning house, partially out of nervous energy, and partially because I wanted everything to look nice in case Caleb stopped by. I prepared ingredients for his favorite dinner, pot roast with vegetables, the same meal I'd made for every one of his childhood birthdays, thinking optimistically that he might call and suggest coming over. As evening approached and my phone remained silent, the familiar ache of disappointment began to settle in my chest. But this wasn't the mild hurt of a forgotten holiday or canceled visit. This was something deeper and more devastating, the crushing realization that I had become so invisible in my son's life that even my 80th birthday couldn't penetrate the wall of indifference he'd built around our relationship. I made myself a simple dinner, a sandwich and soup, nothing that required effort or celebration, and ate it while watching the evening news. The pot roast ingredients went back in the refrigerator, unused and suddenly symbolic of my foolish optimism. At 9 o'clock, I gave up pretending that Caleb might still remember. I changed into my pajamas, made a cup of tea, and sat in Edmund's. old recliner with a book I'd been trying to finish for weeks. But I couldn't concentrate on the words. My mind kept circling back to the question that had been haunting me all day. How does a son forget his mother's 80th birthday? This wasn't like forgetting a casual friend's birthday or missing a coworker's anniversary. This was forgetting the most significant milestone in the life of the woman who'd sacrificed everything for his success. The woman who'd co-signed every loan, mortgaged her house multiple times, and devoted 35 years to building the business empire that had made him wealthy. By 10 o'clock, I was fighting back tears of humiliation and hurt. Not just because of the forgotten birthday, but because of what it represented. The complete erosion of any expectation that I mattered in my son's life beyond my usefulness as a financial guarantor. At 10:30, I did something I rarely allowed myself to do. I wallowed in self-pity. I thought about all the birthdays I'd made special for Caleb, all the celebrations I'd planned and paid for, all the times I'd put his happiness above my own needs. I thought about the sacrifices I'd made, the design school dreams I'd abandoned, the retirement savings I'd risked, the social life I'd neglected while working 12-hour days to support his ambitions. And what did I have to show for it? A son who couldn't be bothered to remember the most important birthday of my life. At 11, as I was preparing to go to bed early, because there seemed no point in staying awake hoping for acknowledgement that clearly wasn't coming, my phone finally rang. For one wild moment, my heart leaped with hope. Maybe Caleb had remembered. Maybe he was calling to apologize and suggest a late dinner, or promise to take me out tomorrow. Maybe there was still some trace of the loving boy I'd raised somewhere beneath the successful businessman he'd become. But the caller ID display crushed that hope immediately. It wasn't Caleb. It was First National Bank of Millfield. Mrs. Washington? The voice was crisp, professional, and completely unfamiliar. This is Jennifer Martinez from First National's Commercial Lending Department. I'm calling about the Clearwater Electronics expansion loan that you co-signed in 2019. I glanced at the clock. It was 11:15 p.m. on my 80th birthday, and I was receiving a business call about my son's loan obligations. The irony was so bitter I almost laughed. The annual renewal paperwork was due yesterday, Jennifer continued, and we haven't received the updated financial statements and documentation. The grace period expires at midnight tonight, and if we don't have the renewal by then, the loan will go into technical default. My blood went cold. I remembered signing the original loan documents, a substantial credit line that Caleb had described as routine business financing, but which I now realized represented millions of dollars, in debt secured by both business assets and personal guarantees. I assumed my son had handled the renewal, I said slowly, my mind racing through the implications. This is the first I'm hearing about any deadline. According to our records, Mr. Wright was supposed to submit the renewal documentation 60 days ago. We've sent several notices to the business address, but we haven't received any response. Since you're listed as the primary guarantor, we're required to notify you before the loan enters default status. Default status. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. If Clearwater Electronics' primary loan went into default, the bank could call in the entire debt immediately. They could seize business assets, freeze accounts, and, most terrifyingly, pursue collection against the personal guarantees I'd signed, my house, my savings, my financial security. Everything I owned was collateral for loans that were about to enter default because my son, the son who couldn't remember my 80th birthday, had apparently also forgotten to handle routine business paperwork. What are my options? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. The documentation needs to be submitted before midnight to avoid default, Jennifer explained. If you have the financial statements and updated business information, you could fax them to our emergency processing center tonight. Otherwise, the loan enters default status at 12:01 a.m., and we'd need to begin collection procedures on Monday morning. I hung up the phone and sat in the darkness of my living room, staring at the clock as it ticked toward midnight on my 80th birthday. In less than an hour, my financial security would be in jeopardy because the son I'd sacrificed everything for had forgotten not just my birthday, but also the basic business responsibilities that kept our empire functioning. And in that moment, sitting alone in the house I'd mortgaged multiple times to fund his success, I made a decision that would change everything between us forever. If Caleb could forget his mother's 80th birthday, then perhaps it was time for his mother to forget something equally important. The loan renewal deadline would pass at midnight, exactly 45 minutes after my forgotten birthday officially ended, and this time, I was going to let it. As I sat in my darkened living room, watching the clock tick toward midnight and financial catastrophe, something unexpected happened. Instead of panic or fear, I felt a strange, crystalline calm settle over me. For the first time in decades, I wasn't rushing to solve a problem that Caleb had created. I wasn't scrambling to protect him from the consequences of his own negligence. I was simply sitting still, letting reality unfold according to its own logic. The phone rang again at 11:35. This time, it was Caleb. "Mom!" His voice was tight with panic, completely different from the distracted tone I'd grown accustomed to during our recent conversations. "Did you get a call from the bank? Something about loan documentation?" "Yes," I said simply. "About 20 minutes ago." "Thank God. Listen, I need you to call them back immediately. There's been a massive miscommunication with our accounting firm. They were supposed to handle the renewal paperwork, but apparently there was some mix-up with the filing deadlines. I just got off the phone with Jennifer Martinez, and she said, if we don't get the documentation submitted in the next 25 minutes, the entire loan goes into default." His words tumbled out in a rush, and I could hear the fear beneath his usual confident demeanor. This wasn't the successful businessman who'd grown too important to remember his mother's birthday. This was a man facing the potential collapse of everything he'd built, suddenly desperate for help from the woman he'd been taking for granted for years. "I'm sending you all the financial statements and business documentation right now via email," he continued frantically. "You just need to print everything out and fax it to the bank's emergency processing center. The number is on the letterhead. Mom, this is crucial. If we miss this deadline, they can call in the entire loan immediately. We could lose everything. Everything." The word hung in the air between us, loaded with irony that I wasn't sure he was capable of recognizing. Caleb was terrified of losing everything he'd built, but he'd already lost something infinitely more valuable: the love and respect of the woman who'd made his success possible. "What time did you realize the deadline had passed?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "About an hour ago. I was reviewing some contracts for the new Bloomington location when I found the renewal notices in a stack of papers that my assistant was supposed to handle months ago." "Mom, I can't tell you how sorry I am about this mix-up. I know it's late, but if you could just—" "Caleb," I interrupted quietly. "What day is today?" The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear the wheels turning in his mind, the desperate calculation as he tried to figure out why I was asking such an apparently irrelevant question when his business empire was hanging in the balance. "It's Thursday," he said, uncertainly. "April 15th. Mom, why are you asking about the date? We only have 20 minutes before the deadline." "April 15th. He'd said the date out loud, but there was no recognition in his voice, no sudden realization of its significance. My son knew the exact date, the date of my 80th birthday, but it meant nothing to him beyond its proximity to his financial crisis. "My birthday," I said softly. "Today is my 80th birthday, Caleb." Another silence, this one longer and more terrible than the first. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and strained. "Oh God. Mom, I completely forgot. I've been so focused on the Bloomington expansion and the contract negotiations. There's no excuse. I'm so sorry." But even his apology was hurried, distracted by the looming midnight deadline. He was sorry for forgetting my birthday, but his primary concern was still the loan documentation that could save his business. Even in this moment of recognition, I remained secondary to his financial interests. "I'll make it up to you," he said, quickly. "We'll have a huge celebration this weekend. Dinner at the nicest restaurant in Westbridge, flowers, anything you want. But right now, I really need you to help me with these loan documents. Please, Mom, I'm begging you." There it was, the dynamic that had defined our relationship for decades, crystallized into one desperate phone call. Caleb's needs were urgent and non-negotiable, while my feelings could be addressed later, when convenient, as time permitted. My 80th birthday could be celebrated belatedly, but his business crisis required immediate attention and sacrifice. "The email with the documents should be in your inbox now," he continued, his voice growing more frantic as he checked the time. "Please, just print everything out and fax it to the bank. We have 18 minutes. I walked slowly to my computer, my movements deliberate and unhurried despite the urgency in my son's voice. The email was there, just as he'd promised, with multiple attachments containing financial statements, business projections, and legal documents that represented millions of dollars in debt secured by my personal guarantees. As I stared at the screen, scrolling through page after page of dense financial information, I was struck by a revelation that had been building for years, but had finally crystallized in this moment of crisis. This wasn't just about a forgotten birthday, or even about decades of taken-for-granted sacrifice. This was about the fundamental structure of our relationship and my role in enabling a dynamic that had stripped me of dignity, respect, and basic consideration. Every loan I'd co-signed, every personal guarantee I'd provided, every time I'd put my financial security at risk for Caleb's business ventures. I'd done it out of love, but I'd also done it without conditions, without expectations, without demanding the basic respect and consideration that any human being deserves from their family. And in doing so, I'd taught my son that my love was a limitless resource that required no reciprocal investment. I'd trained him to treat my support as an entitlement rather than a gift. I'd created a dynamic where his needs were always urgent, and mine could always wait. The loan documents on my computer screen represented 35 years of that dynamic. Millions of dollars in debt that I'd guaranteed without hesitation, business, risks that I'd absorbed without question, financial obligations that could destroy my security if Caleb's empire ever collapsed. And what had that unconditional support earned me? A son who couldn't remember my 80th birthday, but could remember my phone number when he needed me to save his business? "Mom?" Caleb's voice crackled through the phone speaker. "Are you printing? The documents. We have 15 minutes. I looked at the printer sitting silent on my desk, then at the clock showing 11:47 p.m., then at the email full of loan documents that would save my son's business if I acted quickly. Everything he'd built, everything he'd achieved, everything that had made him wealthy and successful, all of it dependent on my willingness to continue being the reliable, selfless mother who always put his needs first. But for the first time, in 35 years, I found myself asking a different question. What would happen if I didn't? What would happen if, instead of rushing to solve Caleb's crisis, I simply sat still and let him experience the consequences of his own negligence? What would happen if the woman who'd spent decades remembering everything for everyone else finally chose to forget something crucial? "Mom, please." Caleb's voice was desperate now. "I know I messed up with your birthday, and I know I've been a terrible son lately, but I'm begging you to help me with this. I can't lose the business. Everything we've built together. Please don't let it all fall apart because of my mistake. Everything we've built together." The phrase would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. Caleb still saw our relationship as a partnership, still believed he'd earned my support through some form of mutual cooperation. He had no awareness that for years he'd been taking everything while giving nothing in return. I moved my mouse cursor to the printer icon, hovering. over the button that would set the documents printing and allow Caleb to submit the renewal before midnight. One click, and his business would be safe. One click, and our relationship would continue exactly as it had for the past decade, with him taking my support for granted and me enabling his indifference to my needs. Or I could simply close the laptop and go to bed. The choice was mine, and for the first time in decades, I realized I had the power to teach my son what forgetting really felt like. 12 minutes, Mom. Please. I closed the laptop. I'm sorry, Caleb, I said quietly. I seem to have forgotten how to work the printer. The silence that followed was profound and terrible, filled with the sound of consequences finally catching up to choices made and choices avoided. In that silence, both of us began to understand that our relationship would never be the same again. Some things, once forgotten, change everything. The silence on the phone line stretched for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 seconds. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, filled with a kind of shocked disbelief that I'd never heard from him before. You forgot how to work the printer? There was something almost childlike in his tone, as if he was trying to process a reality that didn't fit with his understanding of how the world worked. In Caleb's experience, I always solved problems. I always came through in emergencies. I always put his needs first, no matter the cost to myself or the inconvenience to my life. Yes, I said simply. I seem to have forgotten. But Mom, you've had that printer for 3 years. You use it all the time. You printed Christmas cards on it just last month. His voice was rising now, panic bleeding through the confusion. This isn't the time for technical difficulties. The deadline is in 10 minutes. I could hear him moving, around on his end of the line, probably pacing his expensive hardwood floors or staring out the windows of his Oakmont Hills mansion, trying to figure out how to solve this crisis without my help. It occurred to me that this might be the first time in decades that Caleb had faced a serious problem that he couldn't simply hand off to me to fix. Maybe you could call a neighbor, he suggested desperately, or drive to a 24-hour copy center. There's gotta be one somewhere in Brookhaven that's open this late. At my age, I don't drive at night anymore, I replied, which was true. And I wouldn't want to bother the neighbors at this hour. It's almost midnight. Mom, this is an emergency. He paused, and I could hear the sound of his own breathing, rapid and shallow. This is everything. If this loan goes into default, they can seize all the business assets. They can come after the personal guarantees. We could lose the stores, the house, everything. Even now, in his moment of panic, Caleb was framing this as a shared crisis, as if his failure to handle basic business responsibilities was somehow our collective problem to solve, as if the consequences of his negligence should automatically become my emergency. That does sound serious, I agreed. How did this happen? Exactly? I don't know. His voice cracked with frustration. My assistant was supposed to handle the renewal paperwork. The accounting firm was supposed to track the deadlines. Somebody dropped the ball, and now we're all going to pay for it. Somebody. Anyone but Caleb himself. Even facing the collapse of his empire, he couldn't take responsibility for his own failure to oversee the basic administrative tasks that kept his business functioning. The loan renewal wasn't some obscure technical requirement. It was a routine annual process that he'd delegated and then forgotten to verify. Maybe, I said carefully. This is one of those situations where forgetting something important has consequences. Another long silence. When Caleb spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, more uncertain, as if he was beginning to grasp that this conversation was about more than printer malfunctions and loan deadlines. Mom, are you doing this on purpose? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that neither of us had been willing to acknowledge for years. Was I deliberately allowing his business to fail? Was I choosing revenge over family loyalty? Was I letting decades of accumulated resentment override my maternal instincts? "I'm not doing anything, Caleb," I said truthfully. "For the first time in a very long time, I'm simply not doing anything. I'm not rushing to solve your problem. I'm not sacrificing my comfort to fix your mistake. I'm not putting your crisis ahead of my own needs." "Your needs?" The confusion in his voice was genuine. "What needs?" "Mom, I don't understand what you're talking about. What does any of this have to do with your needs?" And there it was. The question that revealed everything about how completely our relationship had become distorted over the years. Caleb literally couldn't comprehend what my needs might be in this situation because he'd learned to think of me as a resource rather than a person. My function was to provide support, not to have needs of my own. "Today was my 80th birthday," I said quietly. "A milestone that comes once in a lifetime, if you're lucky enough to reach it. I spent the entire day hoping you might remember, might call, might suggest celebrating together. Instead, I spent it alone, realizing that I've become invisible in your life except when you need something from me. I said I was sorry about that. I promised we'd celebrate this weekend. After you handle your business crisis, after you solve your immediate problem, after you take care of the things that really matter to you." My voice was steady, but I could feel decades of suppressed hurt rising to the surface. "My birthday can wait because it's not urgent. My feelings can be addressed later because they're not a financial emergency. I can be forgotten because I'll always be here when you need me." I heard him take a shaky breath. I don't think of you that way. Don't you? When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you visited without needing me to co-sign something or provide some form of support? When was the last time you treated me like a person whose time and feelings matter rather than a convenient solution to your problems? The silence stretched longer this time. Through the phone, I could hear the grandfather clock in his house chiming midnight, the same clock that had once belonged to his father, which I'd given him when he and Allison bought their first house. The loan deadline had just passed. "Oh, God," he whispered. "It's midnight. The deadline." "Yes," I said simply. "Sometimes when you forget important things, there are consequences you can't undo." "Mom, please. I know I've been a terrible son. I know I've taken you for granted, but don't let my mistakes destroy everything we've built together. Please. There has to be something we can do. Everything we've built together." He was still using that phrase, still clinging to the fiction that our relationship had been a partnership, rather than a decades-long pattern of me giving and him taking. "Caleb," I said gently, "what exactly have you built? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've built a very successful business empire using my financial backing, my personal guarantees, and my unconditional support. But what have you built for us? What have you contributed to our relationship, besides taking advantage of my love?" He started to speak, then stopped. For perhaps the first time in our adult relationship, Caleb was being forced to consider what he'd given versus what he'd received. "I love you," he said finally, and his voice was thick with tears. "I've always loved you. Everything I've accomplished, I've done it to make you proud. Isn't just a feeling, Caleb. It's also a behavior. And your behavior toward me for the past decade has been that of someone who takes my love completely for granted. You've treated my support as an entitlement and my feelings as an inconvenience." The crying started then, deep, wrenching sobs that reminded me of the little boy he'd once been, the child who used to run to me when he was hurt or scared. But this wasn't a scraped knee or a nightmare. This was the sound of a grown man finally confronting the consequences of his own choices. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize. I never meant to." His words dissolved into incoherent apologies and promises. "I know you didn't mean to," I said softly. "That's exactly the problem. You've been hurting me for years without even noticing, because you stopped seeing me as a person whose feelings matter. You learned to think of me as an automatic resource, always available, never requiring consideration or reciprocal care. What can I do? His voice was desperate, broken. How can I fix this? How can I make this right? I don't know if you can, Caleb. Some things once broken can't be repaired. Some trust, once lost, can't be rebuilt. And some consequences, once triggered, can't be undone. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. Caleb's business empire was now in default, his financial security in jeopardy, all because the mother he'd forgotten had finally chosen to forget something crucial in return. But more than that, our relationship had crossed a threshold from which there might be no return. The enabling had stopped. The unconditional support had developed conditions. The automatic forgiveness had been replaced by accountability. What happens now? Caleb asked eventually. Now, I said. You learn what it feels like when someone you depend on forgets something important. And maybe, if you're capable of learning, you figure out how to rebuild a relationship based on mutual respect instead of one-sided sacrifice. Will you help me? With the business, I mean? Is there any way to fix the loan situation? I looked. Around my quiet house, at the birthday cake I'd bought for myself, at the family photos that chronicled decades of love and sacrifice, at the life I'd built around supporting someone who'd forgotten I existed. I'll think about it, I said. But Caleb, if I do help you, things are going to be different between us. Very different. The days of me solving your problems without question are over. The days of you taking my support for granted are finished. If we're going to have a relationship going forward, it's going to be one where my needs matter as much as yours. Yes, he said immediately. Whatever you want, whatever it takes. We'll see, I said. Talk to you soon, Caleb. To you soon, Caleb. I hung up the phone and sat in the darkness of my living room, feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades. The power that comes from setting boundaries and demanding respect. For the first time in years, I had my son's complete attention. The question now was whether he was capable of learning what love with conditions actually looked like. 6 months have passed since that midnight phone call changed everything between Caleb and me, and I'm sitting in the sunroom of my new apartment at Meadowbrook Senior Living Community, watching the autumn leaves drift past my window while I put the finishing touches on this story. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm more content now, at 80 years old, than I've been in decades. The morning after the loan deadline passed, Caleb appeared at my door at 7 a.m., looking like he hadn't slept at all. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive clothes wrinkled, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and tears. He stood on my front porch holding a bouquet of roses, not the expensive, professionally arranged kind he usually sent through a florist, but grocery store flowers that he'd obviously picked up himself on the way over. "Mom," he said simply, "I came to apologize properly, and to ask if you'll help me figure out how to fix this mess I've made." I invited him in and made coffee, real coffee, not the instant kind I'd been making for myself lately to save money. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where we'd planned his first business expansion 35 years earlier, and had the most honest conversation we'd shared in decades. The loan default had triggered exactly the cascade of consequences that Jennifer Martinez had warned about. First National Bank had immediately frozen Clearwater Electronics operating accounts and begun the process of seizing business assets. Suppliers had been notified of the default and were demanding immediate payment on outstanding invoices. 3 of the 6 store locations were facing eviction for missed rent payments that couldn't be processed due to the frozen accounts. But Caleb surprised me. Instead of immediately asking me to fix everything, he spent the first hour taking responsibility for his failures. He acknowledged that he'd become complacent about the administrative details that kept the business functioning. He admitted that he'd been taking my support for granted for years. Most importantly, He recognized that he'd lost sight of the human cost of his success. "I turned into someone I don't like," he said quietly, staring into his coffee cup. "Someone who treats the people who love him like they're just resources to be managed. I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as my mother and started seeing you as my safety net." The apology was genuine, but I'd heard apologies before. What mattered now was whether Caleb was capable of sustained change, not just crisis-driven remorse. "If I help you resolve this situation," I said carefully, "what assurance do I have that things will actually be different between us?" He was quiet for a long time, thinking. "I can't give you assurances," he said finally. "I can only tell you that losing everything has made me realize what actually matters. And what matters is having a real relationship with you, not just having access to your financial support." We spent the next 3 weeks working together to salvage what we could of Clearwater Electronics. I agreed to help, but with conditions that I'd never imposed before. First, any financial assistance would come with formal documentation and repayment terms. Second, Caleb would be required to hire a professional business manager to handle administrative tasks he'd been neglecting. Third, we would have weekly dinners together, not business meetings, but actual family time where we talked about our lives, our feelings, and our relationship. Most importantly, I retained veto power over any major business decisions that affected my financial exposure. No more blind co-signing, no more automatic approval of expansion plans. If Caleb wanted my backing, he'd have to earn it by demonstrating responsible management and genuine consideration for the risks I was taking. The restructuring process was painful, but ultimately successful. We managed to negotiate payment plans with most suppliers and convinced the bank to modify the defaulted loan terms in exchange for additional collateral and stricter oversight requirements. 2 of the store locations had to be closed, but the remaining 4 were consolidated into a smaller, more manageable operation that Caleb could actually supervise effectively. The business survived, but it was no longer the expanding empire that had consumed Caleb's identity for decades. It was a successful regional operation that provided a good living without requiring the kind of financial leverage and constant growth that had nearly destroyed our family. More importantly, our relationship began to heal in ways I hadn't thought possible. Those weekly dinners became the foundation for rebuilding genuine connection. Caleb started calling me just to check in, not because he needed something. He remembered my birthday with a thoughtful celebration that included my friends from the senior center and a photo album he'd created of our family memories. He even learned to cook my favorite meal and invited me over for dinner at his house, where Allison, who had been shaken by how close they'd come to losing everything, made genuine efforts to include me in their social plans. The changes weren't instant or perfect. Old habits die hard, and there were moments when Caleb slipped back into his old patterns of taking my support for granted. But now I had the tools and the confidence to address those moments directly instead of enabling them silently. "I notice you're making assumptions about my availability," I said during one phone call when he casually mentioned needing me to handle some business paperwork on short notice. "Would you like to ask me properly if I'm willing to help and if this timing works for me?" The pause that followed told me he'd heard my point. "You're right, Mom. I'm sorry. Would you be willing to help me with this paperwork? And if so, when would be convenient for you? These might seem like small changes, but they represent a fundamental shift in how we relate to each other. Caleb now treats me like a person whose time and feelings matter, not just a resource to be accessed when convenient." 3 months ago, I made another significant change. I sold my house in Brookhaven and moved into Meadowbrook Senior Living, a beautiful community about halfway between my old neighborhood and Caleb's home in Oakmont Hills. The decision surprised everyone, including myself, but it's turned out to be exactly what I needed. I have my own apartment with a small kitchen and plenty of space for the hobbies I'd neglected for decades. I've started painting again, watercolors of the gardens here, Portraits of my new friends, abstract pieces that express emotions I'd suppressed for years. I've joined the community book club, started attending weekly bridge games, and even began volunteering at the on-site elementary school where I help children with art projects. For the first time since Edmund died, I have a social life that exists, independently of my son's needs and schedule. I have friends who know me as Madeline, not as Caleb's mother or the lady from the electronics store. I have activities that I choose because they bring me joy, not because they serve someone else's agenda. Caleb visits every Sunday now, and sometimes he brings Allison and their friends, but the visits are relaxed and genuine, focused on spending time together rather than solving problems or discussing business crises. We play cards, take walks around the community gardens, and have the kind of easy conversations that had disappeared from our relationship years ago. Last month, he helped me hang my paintings in the community art show, and I watched him study each piece with the focused attention he'd once reserved only for business matters. "These are really beautiful, Mom," he said, and I could hear the genuine appreciation in his voice. "I didn't know you were so talented." "I've always been talented," I replied with a smile. "You just forgot to notice." The lesson in all of this isn't that cutting off support is the answer to every dysfunctional family relationship. The lesson is that love without boundaries becomes enablement, and enablement ultimately serves no one well. By allowing Caleb to take my support for granted, I'd robbed him of the opportunity to develop genuine appreciation and reciprocal care. By never demanding respect, I'd taught him that my feelings were optional considerations in our relationship. But by finally setting boundaries, by choosing to forget something crucial when he forgot something important, I created space for our relationship to evolve into something healthier and more sustainable. Today is April 15th, 2021, exactly 1 year after the birthday that changed everything. This morning, Caleb called at 8 a.m. to wish me a happy 81st birthday and to confirm our dinner plans for this evening. He's taking me to my favorite restaurant, the little Italian place where Edmund and I used to go for special occasions, and he's invited 3 of my closest friends from Meadowbrook to join us. It's not the relationship I once had with my son, but it's better. It's built on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. It's sustained by genuine care rather than automatic obligation. And it's teaching both of us that love expressed through boundaries and expectations is actually stronger and more meaningful than love that asks for nothing in return. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop protecting them from the consequences of their choices. Sometimes teaching someone what forgetting feels like is the only way to help them remember what really matters. And sometimes, when you finally start putting yourself first, everyone else learns to treat you better too. The business loan was eventually restructured and is performing well under professional management. Clearwater Electronics continues to operate successfully as a smaller, more sustainable enterprise. But more importantly, the relationship between a mother and son who had lost their way has been rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect, genuine appreciation, and love that flows in both directions. Not every story of family dysfunction has a happy ending, but this one does. Because sometimes when you have the courage to stop enabling and start expecting, people surprise you by rising to meet those expectations. After 81 years on this earth, I've finally learned that the most powerful word in the English language isn't yes, it's no. And the most important thing you can forget is how to automatically sacrifice yourself for people who've forgotten to value your sacrifice. Some lessons are worth waiting a lifetime to learn. 5 years have passed since that midnight phone call. That changed everything, and I'm writing this final chapter from my art studio. Yes, I finally have a real art studio at Meadowbrook Senior Living. At 85, I've become something I never expected to be in the twilight of my life. An artist whose work hangs in galleries, a woman whose paintings sell to collectors, and most surprisingly, a mother whose relationship with her son has become a source of joy rather than heartache. The transformation didn't happen overnight. And it wasn't always smooth. But looking back now, I can see that forcing Caleb to confront the consequences of taking me for granted was the best gift I could have given both of us. Clearwater Electronics still operates successfully, but it's a very different company than the empire Caleb once envisioned. After the near collapse of 2020, we restructured it into 4 profitable locations with professional management and sustainable growth practices. Caleb no longer works 18-hour days or dreams of endless expansion. Instead, he's learned to appreciate what he has and manage it responsibly. The business provides a comfortable living for his family and employs 32 people in our community, including 3 young electronics enthusiasts whom Caleb personally mentors, passing on the technical knowledge his father taught him decades ago. He's become the kind of employer and community leader that Edmund would have been proud of. More importantly, Caleb has learned to separate his identity from his business success. He's discovered hobbies. He plays tennis now, has joined a book club, and volunteers at the local animal shelter with Allison. The man who once measured his worth entirely by financial achievement has found fulfillment in simpler pleasures. Change in Caleb has been remarkable to witness. He calls me every Tuesday evening, not because he needs anything, but because we've established it as our regular time to catch up. He remembers not just my birthday now, but the anniversaries of Edmund's death, my parents' birthdays, and other dates that matter to our family history. Last Christmas, instead of expensive but impersonal gifts, he gave me something precious: a handwritten journal containing all his childhood memories of our time together, stories about our trips to Blue Pines Resort, moments from the electronics store, lessons I taught him that he'd carried into adulthood. Reading his words, I realized that even during the years when he seemed to have forgotten me entirely, the foundation of love I'd built had remained solid beneath the surface. "I want my own children to know their grandmother the way I remember knowing you," he wrote in the journal's introduction. "Before business consumed my perspective, before success made me forget what really mattered, you were the center of my world. I'm sorry it took nearly losing everything to remember that you still should be." Yes, children. Caleb and Allison. Welcomed twins 18 months ago, a boy and girl they named Edmund and Grace. Becoming a grandfather has been one of the unexpected joys of my later years, but more importantly, watching Caleb parent has shown me that the loving boy I raised is still very much alive within the successful man he became. Perhaps the most surprising development of these past 5 years has been my emergence as a serious artist. What started as a hobby in my Meadowbrook apartment has evolved into something much more significant. My paintings, mostly watercolors of family memories, community gardens, and abstract expressions of emotion, have been featured in 3 gallery shows and have attracted the attention of collectors who appreciate what they call my authentic voice and emotional honesty. Last month, the Westbridge Cultural Center commissioned me to create a series of paintings depicting the history of small-town businesses in our region. The irony wasn't lost on me that my art career was finally flourishing at 85 decades, after I'd given up those dreams to support Caleb's ambitions. But I've learned that some dreams are worth waiting for, and that creativity doesn't have an expiration date. My paintings are better now than anything I could have created at 25 because they're informed by a lifetime of experience, loss, love, and hard-won wisdom. At Meadowbrook, I've built a circle of friendships that brings me daily joy. My bridge club meets twice a week, and we've become a tight-knit group of women who support each other through the challenges and celebrations of aging. I volunteer at the community elementary school, teaching art to children who remind me why creativity matters at every stage of life. I've even, to my own surprise, begun a gentle romantic relationship with Harold Peterson, a retired carpenter, whose wife passed away 3 years ago. Harold makes me laugh, shares my love of art and gardening, and treats me with the kind of consistent kindness that I'd forgotten was possible. We take walks together, attend concerts, and have discovered that companionship in your 80s can be just as meaningful as romance in your 20s. Caleb was initially protective and slightly suspicious when I told him about Harold, but after meeting him several times, he's become genuinely supportive of our relationship. "I want you to be happy, Mom," he said recently. "You spent so many years making sure I was happy. It's time you focused on yourself." Edmund and Grace, my grandchildren, have added a dimension to life that I never anticipated. At 18 months old, they're just beginning to walk and talk, and watching Caleb with them has completed his transformation in my eyes. He's patient, playful, and completely devoted to their well-being in ways that remind me of the best parts of his childhood. But more than that, becoming a parent has given Caleb a new understanding of what I sacrificed for him. "I can't imagine putting anything ahead of Edmund and Grace's needs," he told me recently while we watched the twins play in Meadowbrook's garden. "But you did that for me for decades. You put your dreams aside, your financial security at risk, your own needs. I don't know how you did it, but I'm grateful every day that you did." The children have also created new traditions for our family. Every Sunday, Caleb and Allison bring the twins to Meadowbrook for dinner and playtime. The twins love the communities, gardens, and playground, and I love watching 3 generations of our family laugh together in ways that felt impossible just a few years ago. People often ask me how I found the courage to finally set boundaries with my son after decades of enabling his behavior. The answer is complex, but it begins with recognizing that unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional tolerance of disrespectful treatment. I learned that saying no to being taken for granted actually opened space for genuine appreciation to grow. By refusing to automatically solve Caleb's problems, I forced him to develop his own problem-solving skills and, more importantly, to recognize the value of the support I'd always provided. The crisis that nearly destroyed our relationship ultimately saved it because it forced both of us to confront uncomfortable truths. Caleb had to acknowledge that success without gratitude is hollow. I had to accept that love without boundaries becomes enablement. For other parents who recognize themselves in my story, I want to say this. It's never too late to change dysfunctional family dynamics. It's never too late to demand respect. And it's never too late to start prioritizing your own needs alongside your children's. But change requires courage. It requires being willing to risk temporary conflict for the possibility of lasting improvement. It requires trusting that people who truly love you will rise to meet higher expectations once you stop enabling them to fall short. As I approach my 90th birthday, still 5 years away but visible on the horizon, I feel a sense of completeness that has nothing to do with business success or financial security. I have a son who loves and respects me, grandchildren who bring me joy, friends who value my company, and creative work that fulfills my soul. The house I once mortgaged multiple times to fund Caleb's dreams has been sold, with the proceeds providing a comfortable retirement that doesn't depend on anyone else's financial decisions. The business loans that once kept me awake at night have been restructured and are performing well under professional management. Most importantly, I've learned that it's possible to love someone completely while still maintaining boundaries that protect your own dignity and well-being. I've discovered that the most powerful gift you can give your adult children isn't endless support, but the expectation that they treat you with the same respect they show other important people in their lives. The 80-year-old woman who sat alone with a grocery store birthday cake, feeling invisible and taken for granted, has been replaced by an 85-year-old woman who wakes up each morning knowing that her time, her feelings, and her needs matter to the people who claim to love her. Some stories end with dramatic reconciliations or complete separations. Mine ends with something quieter, but perhaps more valuable. A relationship rebuilt on mutual respect, sustained by genuine care, and strengthened by the understanding that love expressed through appropriate boundaries is ultimately more meaningful than love that asks for nothing in return. If you're reading this story and seeing yourself in it, whether as the giving parent or the taking child, Know that change is possible at any age. Know that it's never too late to demand better. And know that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to stop enabling someone to treat you poorly. The loan that was forgotten has been repaid in full, both financially and emotionally. The birthday that was ignored has been followed by 5 years of remembered celebrations. And the relationship that nearly collapsed has been rebuilt into something stronger and more sustainable than what came before. At 85, I'm finally living a life where I matter, not just as a resource to be accessed when needed, but as a person whose joy, growth, and well-being are valued by the people who love me. It only took 8 decades to learn that lesson, but some wisdom is worth waiting a lifetime to discover. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.